Good evening, commissioners, staff, and welcome to the last Planning Policy Commission of 2023. I'm glad you could all be with us this evening. And tonight we'd like to call the Planning Policy Commission to order. And it is currently 6:34 p.m. Tonight's meeting is a hybrid meeting. The Planning Policy Commission is in person, but staff or members of the public may be attending virtually or in person. Stephen, do we have a quorum this evening?
Chair Voice, yes, you have a quorum tonight. Commissioner Altamore has an excused absence.
All right, thank you. Our first item of business tonight is to take action to approve the minutes for the November 9th and 15th PPC meeting. Assuming that all of you have read your agenda packets, are there any concerns regarding the November 9th meeting minutes?
You want typos?
Do we want typos, Stephen?
I'll tell you one later. Okay, good. Little one.
Okay.
No concern.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Nina. Those meeting minutes are approved, also with some typos. Just one typo. The same for the November 15th meeting minutes, which was a joint meeting with the EVC. Are there any concerns as far as that set of minutes? All right, the November 15th meeting minutes are approved. Our next item of business is public comment. And before we get into the rules, I'll just ask Stephen if we have anyone who would like to make public comment this evening.
No one is attending virtually, Chair Voice, and looking around the room, there is no one in person to give public comment.
All right, thank you, Stephen. So we will skip the boilerplate stuff. Moving on, our regular business. We have 3 items under regular business tonight, and the first is the SEPA analysis scope for the Comprehensive Plan Periodic Update. Sarah, I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I'm going to try. Dick Roger? Sarah Dick Roger, our planning consultant, will be presenting tonight. So Sarah, whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
There we go. Sorry. We are updating the comprehensive plan and helping with the city's environmental impact statement for that. So I can figure out how to change the slide. Okay. So first, we're going to start off with the purpose of the presentation tonight. So we want to get input from you all on the SEPA scoping process and also the growth alternative that we are going to be considering. So for the agenda, first I'll give just a short, brief background on the comprehensive plan update. Then I'll go into what is SEPA, what is an EIS, what is scoping, and then the growth targets that Issaquah needs to meet, the growth alternatives that we're considering in the EIS, and then also we'll have time for discussion so you all can give your input. So I wanted to start with the discussion questions just so you could keep them in mind and you could think about them in the back of your head as we go through the presentation. All of them will make a little bit more sense when I explain further. But the questions that we want to know your input on are there any topics not listed, which will be listed later, that should be addressed in the EIS analysis? Are there any specific concerns that you all have that should be prioritized in our analysis? And then when thinking about the growth alternatives, we are potentially considering using an alternative that is higher than the growth target. So if we were to do that, what are some important things to consider? So first off, just a little bit of background. Issaquah is currently updating their comprehensive plan. The last plan update was in 2015. It's required to update it, a large update every 10 years. So we're currently in the process of updating it to help refine the vision and make sure that the comp plan really aligns with the community's goals and values. So when you're doing a comp plan update, you have to follow SEPA. What is SEPA? SEPA stands for the State Environmental Policy Act. And SEPA is a process where you identify and analyze the environmental impacts that are associated with large decisions, large projects, and in this case, the comprehensive plan update. And the goal really is to identify the environmental impacts and then identify ways to mitigate or reduce. So what is an EIS? EIS stands for Environmental Impact Statement. And as part of SEPA, part of the State Environmental Policy Act, you're required to see if your decision or your project, and again, in this case, the comp plan update, has significant enough impacts to need an environmental impact statement. In this case, that's already been determined. We do need to do an environmental impact statement. So that is going to be required for the update. And this is a large informational document that really lays out all of those environmental impacts that will be happening with the growth and with the update and the plans for different things in the update. Again, it's used to mitigate those problems. So we identify them, we analyze them, and think about ways that we can reduce or mitigate. More specifically, an EIS includes existing conditions for the city, proposed policies, and different growth alternatives. So that's where the growth alternatives come in, and I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. It also includes, like I said, those adverse environmental impacts, ways to mitigate them, and then any potential unavoidable impacts as well. So the topics to be analyzed in the EIS are very similar to the comp plan element. So you'll see the first 8, I believe, are the same as comprehensive plan elements that Issaquah is going to have. And then the last 2 are additional topics that we're going to analyze in the EIS, the energy and natural resources, and also so these are the topics that we'll look back at them later during the discussion and talk about whether or not you guys have any other ideas for topics that you think should be analyzed during this process. So what is scoping? We all just came from, and a couple of you, the scoping meeting that we had with the public and the open house about the comprehensive plan just now over at the community center. But scoping is the first step in creating the EIS. You have to hold a scoping period. It's required to be 30 days. In this case, Issaquah is opened on November 24th, and it will be open all the way until January 5th. We decided to do a little more than 30 days just because of the holidays to make sure everyone had time to put their input in. But the purpose of scoping is to identify all of the elements that are going to be evaluated. So we have that topics list currently, but that's not necessarily set in stone, so that's what we want to get your input on. And we're going to also gain consensus on the issues that are most significant, and then provide that public comment period so that the public and you all can comment on key environmental issues and concerns. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about Issaquah's growth targets. So the state, Washington, sets population projections, and then therefore growth targets get sent down to the counties and the cities based on those population projections. So Issaquah's targets for housing and employment in the next 20 years are 3,500 new housing units and 7,950 new jobs. So you can see in the first column is the baseline. We're using 2018 as the baseline. So there is some gap in how many housing units have been built since 2018 that are not being considered. We're using the baseline, and this is net new from then. And then in the last column, you can see the capacity that Issaquah has. So there's plenty of capacity to meet the target currently. So for the growth alternatives that I was talking about earlier, in an EIS, it's required to identify a reasonable range of alternatives for that growth target or for that growth plan. So sometimes that's 2 alternatives, sometimes that's 3 alternatives. In some cases, that's 4 alternatives. And that's something that we have not decided yet as a team what the alternatives are going to be specifically. So I have a couple examples just to give you an idea of what those growth targets or growth alternatives might look like, but that's not something that we've actually decided on yet. But the alternatives will represent different growth strategies with varying types and locations of that growth. So it really just determines where the growth is going to be allocated. So here you can see an example. For example, alternative A would have 95% of growth in central Issaquah, with 5% of growth being outside central Issaquah. That's just an example of how we could narrow it down. And then alternative B could have 80% of growth in central Issaquah and 20% of growth outside central Issaquah. So when I talk about growth alternatives, that's kind of what we're talking about. We're mostly deciding what percentage of growth, those 3,500 housing units and those 7,950 jobs, where those are going to be allocated. And again, we haven't exactly pinpointed what those numbers are going to be and what those alternatives are going to be. And that's kind of what we want your input on tonight as well. If you think we should consider one that's higher than those growth targets, or if we should just stick with the growth targets and have different percentages.
Just a clarification.
Yeah.
On the jobs number, remote workers, do those go into those? So if someone is now going to be, who normally would have gone into Seattle, but now they are able to do remote work, does that go towards the Issaquah employment jobs number?
That is
Long-range planning manager, Steve Padua. So that's actually a really great question. We don't have a clear answer from the region on how remote jobs are being counted, whether it counts towards where the employee lives or where the employer is physically located. And so that's something that we're hoping to get clarification on throughout this process.
Commissioner Zamora?
Would it make a difference? Or I guess the intent of the 7,500 new jobs, is it to be physically here, like the actual business? And I guess that could go to that questioning on to see exactly where, if it factors in people sitting here but working in Seattle, basically.
Yes, so the intent with having the targets for within city was to kind of try to tackle some of that inflow outflow of trying to have people work and live in the city so that we're minimizing the impact of that growth, particularly on traffic.
Yeah.
In terms of like what we're trying to achieve as a city.
Okay, so that goes to Commissioner's point, basically.
Correct.
Okay.
Commissioner Milligan?
Since we're doing clarifying questions. Okay, number one, I don't think that this was in our packet, this chart and the alternatives. Is that correct?
So
These
example that's on-
example growth alternatives. We were asked in the packet that we were going to consider growth alternatives, but I don't remember being presented with the alternatives in our
This is
packet.
just a hypothetical example that we're just going to be discussing, just to give you an idea of what it will be evaluated for the EIS.
Good point, because I was completely lost. What are the growth alternatives when I was reading the packet? You're asking a question, I didn't know what they would be or what they could be. And then the other clarifying question, Sarah, did you say earlier when you were talking about the base year of 2018, did you mean to say that new units after 2018 could be part of the 3,500?
correct.
That are slated for 2044?
Yes.
Okay,
Exactly.
Thank you.
All right, any other clarifying questions before we move on? Please.
Okay, so that was basically the end of the presentation. So that was a good time to ask questions. I just wanted to give you an idea before we do get into the main discussion section of the project timeline. So the draft EIS and the draft comprehensive plan will be ready for review in spring next year, so spring 2024. And then the final versions will be ready for review in the summer next year, with the final comprehensive plan being adopted by City Council hopefully in the fall of 2020. So now we're back to our discussion questions that we posed at the very beginning. I have them broken down on different slides just so we can, for example, this one, look at what the topics listed are. But this is meant to be an open conversation, free-flowing, and we want to think about if there's any topics not listed that should be addressed in this environmental impact statement analysis.
All right, well, thank you, Ms. DeKroger. Commissioners, please, now is the time to ask questions and discussion. Commissioner Samweta.
I think it's assumed that like underserved communities within Issaquah would fall underneath, I guess, public services, or where would that fall under within the analysis? Looking at this chart here.
So for underserved communities, it'll kind of depend on the level of services that are established for each of the topic areas. So it could be more than just the public services listed.
Okay.
It could also be transportation. It could be parks and recreation and the accessibility of those type of services as well.
Okay, okay, very well, thanks. And I think that goes to the second question, just making sure that's prioritized as well. That's where some of the impacts go to. Thanks.
Chair Voice, real quick question for staff. With those listings right there, Stephen, is planning policy going to be addressing all of them, or are we going to stay in our general area of focus, like land use, housing, utilities, capital facilities? Or is the idea for all of us to go through all of it? I mean, I know obviously we have a park board, so just kind of getting an idea of what we're going to be looking at in 2024.
So the responsibility of the Planning Policy Commission is to review all the elements in the comprehensive plan. But at the same time, to your point of, we have a lot of boards and commissions that are working deeply on updating a lot of these elements. And so the hope is to start with the recommendations from those boards and have that discussion with the Planning Policy as we're working through the evidence.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Milligan.
Thank you. And sorry for not doing my homework well enough. Are these all the chapters in the comp plan? No. So it's hard for me to see what's not there. So what are we not including in the EIS that we might think should be?
The other elements are arts and culture, and there's one other one that's missing.
Human services is the
Human
other element
services.
that's missing from this list. And those were excluded from this list primarily because they're not required elements. The city has chosen to add those as elements, and they're analyzed a little bit differently because it's more of access and the services we provide, not necessarily from the growth.
Sure, please.
And then another question is, I wanted you to remind me, because I'm not finding it fast enough, when we say environmental impact, it's bigger than trees and birds,
Yes.
right? Can
Yeah.
you remind us what is considered in the impact?
Yes, absolutely. Things like amount of impervious surfaces, water quality, stormwater runoff, climate change and climate resilience. It's like environmental impact is looked at as a broad concept. So all of those things that could possibly be impacted are considered, not just wildlife, vegetation.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
is it also the human environment? You know, what I'm thinking about is, it seems like I'd heard somewhere about culture, for instance, human culture and society.
Mhm.
Are those things included in an environmental impact study?
Go ahead.
Not typically.
Yeah.
It's primarily, a lot of the analysis is done based on the data that's available. And so if we're looking at human culture, there needs to be some type of data set or some type of information that we're analyzing in order to compare it with the growth or the growth alternative that's being assumed for certain areas of the city.
Commissioner Krass.
I think this covers a large swath of things. I mean, there's going to be if you think about 2044, that's right around a link light rail and kind of that's kind of like the big change that's happening. And the question I have is the other areas that have gone through, I'll use Bellevue as an example. Is there any learnings from when they had to kind of plan around their new big transit areas that would shed light of, oh wait, we should make sure we have a double click on certain parts of the EIS because they had something very similar that we're going to have at the end of this period?
That's one of the reasons why I was asking you. Remind me that the historic home is a human environment, was probably part of the EIS, the Winters home. Brought the whole thing down.
Okay, I was waiting to see if there was anything else before I respond. Yes, there is a lot of learning from a lot of our neighboring cities in terms of the process they went through working with Sound Transit to plan ahead. A lot of the work that's going into the transit study is also looking at what are those next steps that we need to determine, and working with coordinating with those neighboring cities and getting from their experience exactly what would work best for City Issaquah to prepare for a lot of that process, because Sound Transit's not going to be ready for discussions for light rail planning until 2027 at the earliest. So right now we're just trying to get ahead of the game.
Commissioner Kraft.
Because once again, if I base it on what's the big bogey that's going to change, it's this big transit center and things like noise. So for example, where would that fall within these items? And you can say any type of pollution, noise, light, but noise is probably the most specific one that people could rally around if there's a lot more on transit.
Noise is definitely something that will be considered in terms of pollution. And in this case, I would say it's looked at how it relates to these topics. So if it's noise related to transportation or towards the light rail station, specifically with the train, specifically with more traffic congestion around that area, it would go under the transportation section, but it's definitely considered in the EIS.
And one thing to think about for the topic of light rail is Sound Transit's also going to be conducting their own SEPA process too. And so if there are impacts from noise or pollution or anything for the surrounding areas, they'll be providing mitigation for that part of the project.
I assume it would be here. The question is, does it deserve to be at the same level as some of these other pieces? Or you want to make sure something like that doesn't get lost, so it's buried under transportation.
Right, to Commissioner Kraft's point, not only noise pollution, light pollution, pollution in general. But I understand what Mr. Kroger's saying, which is that it gets put in the subheadings, but okay.
Great point.
Vice Chair Bader.
Yeah, I can jump in. Think of how to articulate my question. It kind of goes back to Commissioner Esamoide's first point about kind of impacted populations. And when I think of are there topics that not listed that should be addressed? There's a whole bunch of things I think that are not listed that I think should be addressed. And one is where are those impacts most felt? And is this analysis kind of looking at the city as a whole? And what are average environmental impacts, or is there a level of detail that assesses if there are places or populations that are disproportionately impacted, and strategies? Question or is that happening?
We'll take a look at that to see how that can be incorporated as part of this.
I guess the bucket would be seeing if environmental justice is assessed as part of this.
Commissioner Samweta.
Yeah, and that's kind of forward thinking, because environmental justice is it's been around for a long time, but it's a new term, and a lot of municipalities are actually looking into that. right now. So just how that would be thread within this EIS as well, and making sure that it's not hidden underneath these sections, but it's actually brought to the forefront as well.
Great points. Any questions? Anyone else like to go? Commissioner Patterson.
Commissioner Patterson, can you please clarify the context of displacement analysis in the EIS context? Is that like people displacement or resource displacement? What is the?
It's primarily housing and jobs. So
Okay.
looking at displacement of housing as new development comes in, but also displacement of potential employers, so retail, commercial, anything that might get displaced due to new development from the growth alternative that we're looking at.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
So if I may be so bold, we talked, I think it was one of our last meetings, we were talking about Town Square that where Hobby Lobby is. It was sold. I was actually down there this evening and they were talking about how they still have 4 years left on their lease. So that would be kind of looking at things like that, because those jobs would be displaced. But, obviously, these are just rumors, but you know, they're talking about apartments and they'll have retail below. But that would be an example of it, because all those shops would most likely have to be folded in, new infrastructure, new foundations, in order to make those livable commercial.
Yeah, yes, but it's also looking at even the smaller retail shops. So I actually can't think of a great example, but if you look at like a smaller business, not just a big box store, that's some of the smaller retail businesses that communities like Issaquah enjoy having. And so how is that something that we can retain within the city as new development comes in is part of that displacement analysis of where are their potential impacts, and then what are some potential policies or mitigation to either minimize that or prevent it.
Vice Chair Bader?
Yeah, just a clarifying question on that, because back to Commissioner Milligan's point, that feels a little more like human environment impact as opposed to like natural environment impact. Looking at kind of like businesses, right, and the types of, but I guess I just don't see that. Right, if it is, I'm not following.
There's also the environmental, so to what Sarah talked about for the stormwater impacts or the impacts of if we assume more growth in one part of the city more so than the other, then what are the impacts of parks, needs in parks and infrastructure? What are some preserved areas that are nearby that are going to require some mitigation or have some negative impacts on those areas? So there is the natural environment analysis as well, but it's just like the list, it's a pretty broad spectrum of what we're going to be analyzing with these different growth alternatives. But the idea is to kind of try to use the crystal ball to look in the future of where are these negative impacts if we're assuming different growth in different areas of the city.
Commissioner Simweta?
So once the EIS is done, what's next?
So the EIS is really to inform the comprehensive plan update. And so it is used to inform how the comprehensive plan finally is finalized and implemented in the future as well. But it really, the most important thing is choosing that growth alternative and how that will then impact the future and how growth is allocated.
So the mitigations and recommendations from it will be adopted and utilized in essentially moving forward with what that planned growth, basically. So it won't be something where it can essentially stop the actual growth. It's something to help push it along, per se.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it also helps us set up any new policies that we potentially aren't proposing yet to address some of the issues that we just didn't see until after the analysis was done.
Okay. Thank you.
Apologies before, but so we go through this process, come up with a list of impacts, that then council that then like signs off on that, or is there like a higher power that like comes in and says, this is appropriate, right? Or is it up to Issaquah to kind of determine what is appropriate? And then how do we hold ourselves accountable if it is city, obviously knowing that council serves that role to some extent?
It's ultimately up to the city.
Commissioner Milligan.
Okay, so now I'm confused. I thought we were talking about how elements in the comprehensive plan, including all of these listed here, will be analyzed through the lens of an EIS. And then I've heard in the last few minutes, it's all about growth. How does growth impact? And there are plenty of things in here that aren't growth. They're choices of this, that, or the other thing. And are we just talking about the impacts of growth? Or are we talking about the impacts of certain policies in the comprehensive plan and how they impact?
It's the impacts of growth.
Just growth,
Yes.
not all these things.
Well, it's looking at all these things and how
With
growth.
that growth.
Yeah, with that.
Mhm. So it's kind of like a trail. So impact of growth on these things, and therefore these things impact on the environment. With that hypothetical growth being considered. So we're not analyzing these things as they are currently in existing conditions. We're analyzing how they would be with that growth being allocated 95% in central Issaquah and 5% outside Issaquah.
I think to Stephen's point, crystal ball.
Yeah.
And plus, it's a rolling document. I mean, how often would the EIS be updated with the comp plan every 10 years?
Yes, it depends on what actually changes 10 years from now. If we're in a place where everything aligned and it went according to plan and we don't think we need another EIS then from 10 years from now, then we won't do another full one. We would do a supplemental to see if we continue on the same trend.
For my own clarification, I think that makes sense, right? Comp plan is designed plan, right? What growth, how we're going to guide growth minded. Making sure I'm correct.
Thank you.
Commissioner
Thank you, Vice Chair Bader. That isn't the way that I've thought about. If we never grew, we would still need a comp plan to make decisions, to set values, to create standards of how things change. Growth isn't the only change that a city experiences. And so I think of a comp plan as a guiding document that growth is an element of it, or maybe it's not, you know. What if it weren't? Of course, not around here, it wouldn't be, but would not be. But all of these things would still need standards, values, strategies, all those things. You know, like for instance, our parks plan doesn't just have its objectives because the population is getting bigger in the city of Issaquah. One of the objectives of the parks plan is to preserve our riparian areas, reduce flooding, you know, restore the flow of the Issaquah Creek. That's not because we have more people here. It's because Issaquah Creek needed, for instance, some loving care. And so we put it into our guiding document. So I don't think it has to be just about growth. And that's where I am confused, because I look at the packet now and I say, how it guides growth. And I wish
Can I
mentioned
respond to
earlier.
that real quick? So that's a great point. And one of the things that we didn't present because we haven't actually decided what those alternatives are going to be is that there's almost always in an EIS a no action alternative. So we will be analyzing if everything just continued as it was and we did not have that growth, that will be alternative A. That will be included for sure in our analysis. It's called the no action. And then the alternatives that we're deciding on still are those action alternatives that would have different percentages.
Just to clarify really quick, we're looking at multiple different alternatives, and then what the feedback we're getting from you all, and then from the open house, and then as collective staff, we're going through multiple different alternatives. We'll start to narrow it down, and that's what we'll be presenting to the council committee in January.
Commissioner Krass.
So I think there's some kind of key hypotheses when you kind of start a project like this. There's going to be a bunch of big things that change over a 20-year period. 25% more people. That's probably a likely thing, whether it's 20, whether it's 30. There's going to be a lot more people here because the whole area is growing. The nature of work is another big theme that may change. Hence, you may be able to get your jobs number because the nature of work. So there should be some thought and hypotheses on that. There could be another one of with that growth, the demographics change. Schools aren't on here. I'm not sure if that's part of here because you have, where I grew up, they built a bunch of schools, and they closed the schools 15 years later, then they had to reopen them 15 years later. So there's some ebbs and flows, and there's changes when you have big populations. So I would assume when we look at growth, it's almost like there's going to be some big changes in 20 years. And then we mentioned earlier having a transit hub as part of this whole thing, and what's the nature and the hypotheses around how transportation is going to work, which would then have impact on some of those things. I wasn't sure if there's some of those overarching kind of key hypotheses and assumptions that it's not just, a bunch more houses, but there's a bunch of other things that are tied to that. Because there's going to be more people. I mean, unless you plan for a meteorite hitting, and there's going to be something. But there's going to be more people. So I'm just curious, is there other key themes when we talk about growth, not just housing units and jobs, like I just mentioned?
Yes, there is. And then to respond to your comment and give Commissioner Kennedy some credit of asking the question as well on prior to tonight's meeting, schools are considered, it's considered a public service. And so it is analyzed as part of the EIS as well. But because schools are required to do their own type of analysis and determine how they grow out with all the communities that they serve, the city doesn't have as much control for a lot of that, but we do look at the impacts as part of the EIS at a kind of a higher level.
It does touch things like land use and transportation because schools have to be somewhere.
Yes.
Commissioner Samora.
And I think we have to look back at, this is a legal requirement, and when there's going to be any potential impact on a community due to a development or proposed development, by law, there has to be that study, whatever, if it's I think they call it a FONSI, you go the route, I think, of an environmental assessment, but if they find significant impact, you go the EIS route, basically. So I think we're mandated by law to do this. Now, as it pertains to the comprehensive plan, you have the aspect where if you're just normally updating the comprehensive plan and there's going to be no growth, then most likely an EIS or an EIS wouldn't be needed. But it's because they found that there may be a significant impact in what has been planned in the comprehensive plan. Basically, that's why the EIS is moving forward.
That's correct.
Thank you.
And to respond to Commissioner Milligan's comments about, the EIS could be looking at a lot more than just growth. So to what Sarah was saying about this being a required portion of the comp plan, we have limited resources in terms of how much we can actually analyze. But when you're looking at beyond the comprehensive plan, and a lot of our functional plans and strategic plans, they kind of get to what you're looking at in terms of just looking beyond the growth. What does the city want for these specific topic areas? Not just because of growth, but because that's the vision for those topic areas for the city. So that kind of gets to what you were, I think, imagining from the EIS. Am I getting that correctly?
If you were imagining that if we had a policy change, say in land use and sustainability or in climate resilience or in one of these categories, if we had a policy change in the comp plan, what would be the environmental impacts of that policy change? That's what I was imagining. Not just growth on the act of changing a policy or updating a policy or adding a new policy.
So the EIS for the comp plan does kind of take into account a lot of the proposed policies and goals that we are proposing with the comp plan update. Separately, if you're looking at different regulations that we're wanting to update for the different topic areas, there is a separate analysis or SEPA analysis that's done for those as well, whether it's project or non-project based. So this isn't the only environmental impact analysis or environmental analysis that we do. This is just primarily for the comprehensive plan, which the focus of, or what's required of the comprehensive plan, is to look at growth. And so that's primarily why this EIS is focused on the growth impacts.
Vice Chair Bader?
Thanks. Following now. And I kind of get the growth because it feels like when we're talking about policy, right, there's a lot of like, could happen or it could not happen, or it could look like this or it could look like that. And so I understand like growth as like helpful bounds to kind of do the analysis and appreciate the like no growth alternative. So that's making sense to me. Now, I guess my question is, do the functional plans go through some sort of environmental assessment? Because that feels a lot more tangible, right? Of like, if we're setting specific strategies or specific targets, like understanding the impact of those specifically, as opposed to the comp plan, which feels a little bit more like high level.
They do go through an environmental analysis. Depending on what it is, it may go through a full EIS or it may go through something a little bit smaller.
There's something called a SEPA checklist. Don't qualify for these significant impacts that require an EIS. Sometimes there's less significant impacts, and then you do it. So have some of those. Have that.
Any follow-ups? Sarah, were you able to get all the information that you wanted?
Yes. We do have a couple more questions.
Oh.
Yes on this one. The next question is very similar to this question, so we might have already covered it. It's more generally, are there any specific concerns? So I don't want to speak for you, but I do think some of those things have come up already, such as underserved communities or environmental justice. But just making sure if anyone has more comments on any specific concerns that should be prioritized in the EIS analysis. Okay, great. Then we'll move on to the last question. So the last question is going back to those growth alternatives. Again, we have not decided, and we still have a couple options that we're going to narrow it down to. But if we are looking at a growth alternative that would be higher than the growth target shown here, what do you all think is important to consider?
Commissioner Krass?
So are there assumptions that the boundary lines of Issaquah are the same in 2044 as they are now, or is acquisition of other parts of King County that don't roll into a city part of the growth? That'd be one thing I would think of as an alternative. I don't know what the assumption is.
It's pretty safe to say that the boundaries are going to stay as they are.
There's not really a lot more annexable land.
Correct.
Any other? Vice Chair Bader?
I don't know if it's related to this question, but thinking about the jobs and the remote jobs point in particular. So I work remotely for a company based in California. I leave that job doesn't get replaced, right? And so I feel like we need to think about that because remote jobs are not necessarily like stable jobs in the city. Yeah, true. Yeah. True. It's very dependent on Sarah. So me as one of those 7,950 people, because I came since 2018, I'm one of them. So we're actually down to 7,949. But my point being, I think that, like, thinking of the, like, to me, they're different than, like, and especially, like, who works in those jobs, right? And kind of, yeah.
Commissioner Milligan.
I think you said that one of the alternatives would be to change the growth numbers to larger numbers.
We wouldn't be changing the growth targets, just in the EIS or one of the growth alternatives, we might consider numbers that are higher than the targets, but the targets wouldn't change. Because the targets are not determined by the city, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so it would just be an exercise to see what the impacts were if we grew by more.
Correct.
And I'm trying to think up the value of that, and just off the cuff, I think I can think of one reason why that might be a good idea to explore what happens if we grow more, and that is because these growth targets are hardly ever meaningful to us. We had growth targets in the past round of them, and we exceeded them by a great deal. And perhaps if we had evaluated the impacts and understood what the impacts were and what mitigations might have been required, we might have handled that excessive growth better. I don't know. That's an interesting concept, because already I think Sarah kind of hinted that we may have already reached our growth target here in 2023, and I have a list of projects in the city's pipeline currently that will meet that if it hasn't been met already. So it probably will be doubled easily without even trying. So to not evaluate the impacts could be a big miss. If we do evaluate the impacts and see that there are some things that we need to do, we'll be better prepared, because the growth target doesn't stop growth, just our land uses and the economy.
It'd be interesting to see that as an alternative, to look back at the last round of target and see how we exceeded it by what percentage, and then put that, whatever, say it's 15%, and then put an alternative that shows, okay, this is what happens if we were to repeat what happened the last. This is alternative 3. Commissioner Krass.
Quick question. So baseline, let's use housing for a second. So 16.6, do we have line of sight, if you just did a snapshot today, what the number is? I'm just curious of, yeah. I'm just saying, so.
We'd have to get back to you with an exact number.
Yeah, I'm just saying, if we're like 16.8, or are we already at 20, which means you definitely have to have an alternative that's much higher than adding 3,500 to 16.6, because we're already, that's a big unknown. And I do agree, having an understanding of a higher number, especially on housing units, and not everything on that long list. There's going to be a few that you're going to want to, like, land use, housing, transportation. There's a few of them that have a much bigger variability based on that higher number. But maybe not everything. Maybe you don't have to do that double click on everything.
And to Commissioner Krass's point, that might be a lot more helpful, a snapshot of where we are now, than actually looking back at the last growth target. That'd probably be a better idea. Commissioner Kennedy.
So I have a question about how we measure job growth. Given the conversations around remote work, which so many people do these days, I've never seen a survey. So how does the city know that someone sits in their home working for a company in California versus, I mean, we can measure growth if Costco hires, 2,000 new employees sitting in their lovely buildings in Issaquah. We know that. Butts and seats here in the city. But if more and more people are working from home for companies in other locations, how do we know that?
So a lot of the major employers report out to, how many employees they have and the type of work environment that they have. So we actually have to make a lot of assumptions based on the type of industries that we have, what the employees are telling us, and then what's happening in the other cities around us as well.
I would assume they still pay tax.
Well, but I mean, just even that example. How would anyone know, if we're measuring jobs in Issaquah, how would anyone know that she works from home for a company in California?
So I'm a unique case where I am the only Washington State employee in my little company of 20 people. And so my home is actually the registered office in the state of Washington of my company. And so I don't know if Issaquah somehow, unlike the state, whatever the form is, I don't know how to handle that stuff, but like is able to see, right, that like this company has like my house as, I wonder if about like
I'd have to look into
implications of
see
that
how that's
actually,
tracked.
but maybe I shouldn't like have that
But
on
I
the
do
record.
know, when we're looking at a lot of the targets or the assumptions of what to expect for the city, we are looking at industries, how they are situated in other cities. What they can tell us everything they want, but they don't always tell us every detail of where every employee is going to be. So we just have to make several assumptions based on the information that we're given.
Commissioner Samweta?
And the employers in Issaquah are the ones that are feeding you the information on how many employees are coming to their offices, right?
Correct.
Okay.
And then there's also the census that we take information from as well. But yes, it's just the collection of all that information that we put together our assessment on employers as well as even the population.
Okay.
Commissioner Kraft?
So when I think about impacts of growth, we're looking at from understanding what happens in Issaquah. But if I take a step back, a lot of the growth in the next 20 years are going to be, I'll pick on a couple markets, like Maple Valley and Black Diamond. And so there's going to be, because of their growth, a lot of an impact in Issaquah around transportation. How are regional changes of the growth do we handle a part of our EIS, especially around something that's I'll use transportation as the pass-through traffic, or is that just out of scope for, as we think about this?
So as part of the EIS, we do kind of a traffic analysis model, and it looks at regional impacts on us as well as local.
All right. Commissioner Millian, we'll take, oh, no, I'm going to start wrapping this up. Yeah, Commissioner Millian.
Thank you. It would be interesting to know, I was just trying to look it up, there was a statistic published recently about the growth that Costco alone projects in the near term. So that they're talking about business growth. I don't know how much that translates into employment growth, but their campus was going to triple in size, I think, with the development agreement. So that would be interesting to add to the discussion. And then I wanted to answer Commissioner Krass's question about housing units based on the, I had it. How did I lose it? It's in the report card, and it's 17,000 something in the 2022 housing report.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Milligan. If we do have any more comments for Mr. Kroger, where should we send them? Should we send them to you or to Stephen? To Stephen. Okay, so the conversation does not have to end. It's just going to go electronically. But I do want to thank you for your time, for your fantastic presentation. Go ahead.
Were we going to talk, there was an alternative presented earlier about where the growth would go. Are we done talking about that? Or is that?
The example, the example in the presentation was primarily just to explain the type of alternatives that we would look at as part of the EIS.
Well, we're not going to talk about that
It
one.
wasn't necessarily to say, this is one of them that we're considering. It was primarily just to help explain what the EIS does.
Okay. Are we going to hear any other ideas besides growing by a larger housing and jobs numbers? What are the other ideas? How can we talk about them?
Well, the purpose of tonight wasn't necessarily to dive into the different alternatives. It was primarily just if we grow more or less, what are the important topics that we need to consider with the EIS?
That's the only one you wanted to talk about.
Correct.
You don't care about where it is or any of the other alternatives in this context.
Well, I think we've just discussed a lot of where it needs to go, at least when we were discussing the land use element, you know, a lot of the discussion was the vast majority of it needs to go in central Issaquah, which has always been the assumption and what we've been moving for with the target. And so that's a lot of what we're discussing primarily with a lot of the alternatives. But we're looking at different variations and seeing what's reasonable based on different trends that we're seeing, what's going on in the region, but also what also makes sense for Issaquah.
Thank you.
And I believe we see this one.
Yes, yes, the commission will see this again.
Okay, well, again, thank you, Mr. Kroger.
Thank
Great
you very much.
presentation. Thank you, commissioners. And we are going to move along to item B. And before item B, we will be discussing the Parks, Recreation, Trails, and Open Space element for the comprehensive plan periodic update. And for this item, Issaquah's very own Valerie Porter, our associate planner, will be presenting tonight. Give her a second to get comfortable up there. Whenever you're ready, Valerie.
Thank you, Chair Voice. Great introduction. Good evening, everyone. My name is Valerie Porter, and I'm an associate planner with Community Planning and Development. Start the presentation. There we go. So when looking at the goals and policies, back up. Sorry, I'm here to talk about the Parks, Recreation, Trail, and Open Space element. Going forward for time, I'm just going to call it the Parks element. So when looking at the goals and policies for the Parks element, I want everyone to consider the following questions. 1, does the commission have any feedback on the proposed updates? 2, are the proposed goals and policies consistent with the land use element goals and policies? And 3, are there topics not being addressed in the proposed goals and policies? So the Parks Department developed the Park Strategic Plan in 2018, and this document is a roadmap for their vision. So in this park plan, it references the goals and policies. And about a year later, in 2019, the goals and policies were also updated in the Parks element. So because the park element was recently updated, the park staff, they're not proposing many changes to the goals and policies. Many of the policies and goals are going to stay as they are today. Every 5 years, the Park Strategic Plan is updated, and it just happens that their update for their Park Strategic Plan is going to occur the same time as a periodic update. So because of all the updates with these documents, park staff asked their Parks Board, you know, what types of changes would you like to see, or if any changes would you like to see with the goals and the policies? And so they had a discussion and they talked about what they'd like to see. And these are some of the goals that came out of that. They wanted to ensure that the park system it was a balanced park system. They also wanted to make sure that that there was a planning and design consideration. They also wanted to make sure there was environmental preservation, partnerships with other organizations, and then there was also the policies talked about maintenance and stewardship. So one thing I didn't mention is that the Park Strategic Plan is actually going to be renamed to the Park System Plan. And so going forward, you'll be seeing that in some of the documents. After the park staff talked to the Park Board, they came up with these 9 policies. I'm not going to go through all of the policies, but if we want to wordsmith later, I do have some slides that we can go through. But I just wanted to let you know that only 9 policies came out of the Park Board discussion. And the proposed changes addresses coordination with regional visitors, incorporating the Native tribes into the planning and the maintenance process. They also wanted to try to include ARC into the park system. And then they also wanted to highlight some of the programs that they're working on. So the Parks Department is actually in the process of drafting the Urban Forest and Management Plan, which will soon be adopted. And then they also have the Heritage Tree Program, so they wanted a policy to address protecting those trees. So Commissioner Kennedy provided me an email with some of the comments of, you know, what she would like to see possible changes. And so I'm just going to briefly go over some of those possible changes, because I did pass that on to the park staff, and we thought we'd be proactive and try to talk about some of those possible changes. So the first issue brought up was for policy B6. Commissioner Kennedy believed that the text needed to be reworded so that it was just a little bit more definitive. Staff agreed, and so to try to make the policy a little bit more clear and have some clear actions, they're going to try to establish some measurements that will help then make the policy a little bit clearer. After reviewing the policy, they also noticed that they felt like the policy shouldn't be under goal B, but instead be under goal H, which is the level of service. Another issue Commissioner Kennedy brought up was she thought that policy needs to be made more sense under the planning section. And so planning policy, or park policy 18 and 19 will be relocated under the subsection of planning. So it's going to stay under goal D. It's just a subsection of the park planning. And then for policy D20, Commissioner Kennedy thought that this policy best probably should have been combined with the policy B6, because they both talk about the park system and economic benefits. Staff would like the two policies to remain separate, so they're going to consider rewording the text to make it a little bit clearer, so that it's a little bit, the policy is a little bit more clear about what they're trying to achieve. And last, there was a comment regarding E8. And this policy talks about the heritage trees. You mentioned, Commissioner Kennedy mentioned that there should be a definition possibly outlined in this policy. Typically, definitions aren't in policies, but I agree that, or staff agrees that there should be a definition kind of explaining what this is. And so I think going forward, what we're going to look at is including a definition in the Issaquah Municipal Code, just because, again, the comprehensive plan then informs the Issaquah Municipal Code. And so that will be a solution just to make it clear about the next steps. So the policies that staff proposed, these 9 policies, they go to the Parks Board on November 27th. They reviewed it, made a few edits, and they actually support the changes, and then they recommend approval for your guys' review. So the next step after today's meeting will be to take this to the council committee. And then here's just a quick schedule just to let you know that we're still on track to have the comp plan adopted in the 4th quarter of 2024. Again, I'm putting up the questions in case there's any questions, but that concludes my presentation. And then again, if we want to go over any of the policies, I do have some slides so that we can look at them a little bit closer.
Great, thank you, Valerie. Commissioner Kraus.
So thank you. We all love parks.
All love parks.
Everyone loves parks. Can't have enough parks. And this is more of a question, and it may be a broader question, so you may or may not have the specific answer. When you look at whether it's vision or goals, are our parks and the investments that we do for Issaquah residents, one of them said Issaquah residents, or do we look at this as a core asset of Issaquah that brings people regionally into Issaquah, which then would have an impact on economic vitality and other things like that that are important for Issaquah? So, for example, then if you said that was something that was part of the vision, then you will have things that you would do around, you build a music theater in Confluence Park. How do you think about all the ball fields and all of that for regional draw and all of that? So I'm curious, it's like, is this for Issaquah or regional? And if so, how do you think about some of those different policies?
Well, before I try to attempt, first I'm going to punt it to Robin. Do you want to try to answer that? Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Hi, Robin Spear, Park Planning and Development Manager, and I can kind of answer a little bit of that question. But first and foremost, the park system plan is meant for the residents of Issaquah, and that's our main focus, to make sure that the system really represents the values and the needs of the community, first and foremost. But because we are surrounded by the state parks and we are a thoroughway, you know, we do have to think of this regionally as well. And that mainly comes in the economic benefit, the tourists that come in and support the downtown area, support Central Issaquah. So first and foremost, you know, our main focus really is the resident. But we understand that there is an impact, and I think we see it with, even with Jacob the Troll, you know, getting visitors from Seattle, getting visitors from all over the area. Really, it's a huge draw. It's a wonderful draw. It's an amazing amenity now. And it's becoming a great asset for us and supplementing the downtown area. So yeah, they do go hand in hand, certainly.
Great, thank you, Robin. Thank you. Commissioner Simlet.
So in reading at least the text that was given to us, we talk about planning and design as well as maintenance. Where would like asset planning come in? Like, and I have kids, we go to the parks, they play in the playground. Are you guys looking at not necessarily just maintenance, but the life cycle of that equipment? And let's say in the next 5 years it needs to be replaced, or in the next 10 years as well. Where would that be found within the text?
I don't think that's really addressed in the goals and policies. I feel like it's maybe more in the park strategic plan. It's more, or any idea? I just don't think it's addressed at this level. I think that's something a little bit more detailed.
Okay, I think where I was getting at is, because we talk maintenance, but you can only maintain something for so long. So it's just maybe in a functional plan or whichever, going the next step to say, hey, from a policy standpoint, every 10 years we need to renew this asset or these types of assets, basically, to have a plan for. And that feeds into the actual master plan aspect as well. So you can program in those costs as well. So there you go. Thank you.
Yeah, I can certainly address that. That is one thing that the park system plan is looking at holistically, overall, the city overall. Where are our gaps? Where do we need new parks? Where do some of the parks need to be supplemented or renovated? That is something park operations kind of follows and is starting to track more closely. Obviously, it really depends on how much the park is used, how much the equipment is used, and how quickly it kind of erodes or needs to be replaced. So that is definitely something that we're keeping track of. It is now in the CIP plan. And so we'll start incorporating that into the system plan and look at that in more detail.
Thank you. And it's some place I've seen where it could somewhat fall underneath maintenance to understand, okay, how long you have to maintain something before you have to replace it. So It helps with the planning of money, later money, basically.
Yeah, definitely. And that's certainly something that we're looking at, you know, and typically park playgrounds will last, again, depending on how heavily they're used, 10 to 15 years. Mm-hmm. And it really depends on the type of equipment that was placed there. So.
Thank you.
Commissioner Milligan?
Thank you. Mallory, can you put B6 back up there? Thank you for the discussion, and thank you, Commissioner Kennedy, for bringing up some ideas. No, that was the one that had the slide that had the proposed changes. Oh, actually, you can go back to that if it has the goal. Does it have it paired with the goal? Yeah, that's what I want. Okay, so here's what's kind of confusing me is that what leads in this? If we read the goal doesn't say balance the interests of Issaquah residents with regional needs. It says to serve opportunities and interests, needs and interests of Issaquah residents, period. And then the new policy says that we're to balance the needs while balancing residential use with regional visitors. And where I don't argue with the economic benefit and measuring it and all that, I think that's really wonderful. I'm not arguing with any of those. But when I read this, I was thinking about our sports fields. And Issaquah Highlands, I remember that public, there was a little bit of an outcry, shall I say, about turning to artificial turf so that we could serve the needs of a regional demand for sports fields when some of those people, myself included admittedly, might have preferred to have a natural environment in our parks. So to add the policy, not the policy, what is that? Yeah, the policy at the end that says that we're supposed to balance regional, that says regional visitors. And I think it's very careful to distinguish it between that and, I don't know even how you would characterize sports fields as something distinct. And is there anything else like that? Is that its own category, or is that a category of itself? Regional visitors, I believe, are this, the troll and the trails and but still. Anyway, I just bring it up as there's a conflict between the goal and the policy.
And you're speaking specifically, goal B, the balanced park system. Yeah, definitely. And that's really a real hot topic right now is athletic fields. In the regional draw, you'll see a lot of tournaments coming in or the need for more tournaments. So it's something we're definitely looking at. But again, we're going back to looking specifically at the needs of the residents and the community first before we look at any regional take on that.
Did it say that in that policy, Robin?
That we can adjust that for sure.
Is that what you're looking for, Commissioner?
Well, I
Milligan?
think that the careful use of the word visitors or tourism or something that is more about the economic impact and that kind of use, if we're attracting that and not necessarily being the soccer center of the east side, there could be a way of refining that so that it focuses on what we want.
I think it comes down to first principles. Like, what is it? There's not everything is the same priority. So I think if you state, priority 1 is parks for the Issaquah residents, priority 2 is having great resources that expand. And you're right, fields are different than investments you may make for events and stuff like that. I think just being clear of your priorities kind of solves that.
Commissioner Samweta?
Yeah, I think I would piggyback on that as well. I'll use myself as an example. I go to Bellevue. My son plays soccer down there sometimes, with myself sometimes, and I'll go to a local business there and eat ice cream after I go to the park. Same thing as if I go to a park in Highlands, I'll go to the cookie shop right up there. So that's that economic benefit and there. So, but to that prioritization, of course, to the residents within Issaquah, I think that would be pertinent to prioritize that maybe in the text, and then second to the regional visitors, because there will be regional visitors, because 15 minutes down the road you have a park in any direction per se. So thank you.
Great comment. I think we'll bring that back to the park board and bring that up and discuss it with them. Great, thanks.
I'll go. Chair Voice. So the only concern, anyone who's known me on this commission will probably see where I'm going to go with this. I appreciate that there is mention, I believe it's in stewardship and maintenance for safety. I'm just wondering if staff feels like having it as policy F7 and F8 is enough. I'll be the first to admit Issaquah has done a tremendous job keeping well-maintained and very safe parks. Looking around the region, my concern is that some of those things that have happened to other cities starts to trickle into Issaquah. much the same way crime has a little bit. I was actually in 2 establishments in Issaquah today that both were broken in with their ATM stolen, with these new ideas of smashing cars into glass. So you can see some of the things that are happening in bigger cities start to trickle into Issaquah. I'm just wondering, because if we're going to invest all of this time and money into our parks, do we need to make more of a mention, whether it comes to drug abuse or vagrancies in our park? I do live right next to Rainier Trail, and there have been issues on that trail. The city has done a very good job at addressing it, but I do know people that no longer use that trail at night, which is a real shame. It's a beautiful walk. I used to walk it when I first moved to that part of the town. So I'm just wondering, does staff feel that's enough? Just the 1 or 2 policies mentioned. I know some of this would be codified in a different section, but does the park board feel that they've, as far as a goal and a policy, they've made mention enough of it by having it under stewardship and maintenance?
No, that's a really good point, and that's one I can definitely bring up with the rest of the staff, and then particularly the planning staff and planning board. We do follow a practice called, we call it SEPA, Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. So that is one thing that we integrate, and we do have the police chief look at our design specifically for that. I know our maintenance staff looks at that very closely, and our ranger specifically is involved directly in quite a few of those reviews and incidences. So it's something that's always on the operations staff mind. It's something they take very seriously. As a planning staff, we do look at that at every park to make sure. We actually just had a discussion about pickleball and the fencing and the screening that goes up, and making sure that, you know, people can see into the courts. That's really important. So it is something we integrate in every design to some extent. But if you feel strongly that that's something we need to focus on more and make more of a policy in either the planning stage or even in the implementation stage, that's something we can certainly take
It's
a look
something
at.
I definitely like to hear more from the Parks Board.
Okay.
If it's something on their mind. Again, the city's done a tremendous job. But, you know, again, I'm just seeing trends from larger cities, and again, hopefully we can combat them. But I am starting to see other things. And again, I've lived by Rainier Trail for 8 years, and I know there have been problems with that particular trail. And again, Issaquah is very well known for our parks and trails. So I just want to make sure that that is top of mind, especially when we're investing all this time and money and treasure into these parks and trail systems. So I'd like to hear the park board, what they have to say about it, more than anything. I mean, they're the ones who study this closely. If there's any other questions? I think, Valerie, you have more questions for us, correct?
No, I do not.
No? Okay. Commissioners, going once, going twice. Well, thank you, Valerie. Appreciate the presentation. Did you get what you needed?
I did, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Now moving to our last item of business for 2023. We'll be looking at 2024 with our crystal ball and with our senior planner, Stephen Padua, who will be presenting. So Stephen, when you're ready, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Voice. I don't have a fancy presentation for our last topic for 2023, but as Chair Voice said, it's primarily to look at 2024. Very clear. Okay, so for those of you that were able to take a look at the schedule for early 2024, we're trying to keep it a little light, not necessarily because we don't have topics for you. It's primarily because we want to be able to reserve the time to have follow-up discussions on either new policies or policies that are still in discussion with the PDE Council Committee. And we want to make sure we have adequate time to do that before we start rolling into the legislative process with council. And once we start that, we're aiming for a public hearing for the docket in January, and then you'll have another public hearing on the Pioneer project, so a follow-up from your November 15th joint commission meeting to look at what we have planned for that project. And then we're going to be probably, this schedule will get updated in January, and we'll have specific policy discussions because we're still working through the drafting phase and still trying to look at the coordination between the different elements. We want to be able to identify what new policy discussions we need to have with you, and we're just not ready to do that at this time. So those times are reserved for a lot of those policy discussions early next year. There's going to be a new topic that we'll be bringing to you. We're getting recommendations from Arch. So we'll be bringing actually some new policy discussions for you, probably around February, March timeframe. And then we're going to be going for the public hearing for the comprehensive plan, and then going into the legislative process with council for the comprehensive plan. After that, we're going to start kicking off discussions on annual housekeeping for code updates, and then starting to have our housing program discussions. So looking at a lot of those housing, the multifamily tax exemption, the looking at housing regulations, a lot of the follow-up to the housing report that was released earlier this year, to look at what do we need to look at to try to drive more development and residential development within Central Issaquah. There was a lot thrown out just for the 2 halves of the year. Are there any questions if you were able to take a look at the work plan?
I'll just bring up something real quickly, Stephen. So this year, this coming year, the city is now implementing cultural holidays. So that means on the ones that do fall on our PPC meetings, we're going to obviously observe those holidays. We won't be meeting. Is the idea right now, because we don't know what our schedule is going to look like, would we try to reschedule those meetings?
Right now, we would assess prior to each of those meetings, at least a couple months prior to this meeting, to see if we need them.
Okay.
For now, you can assume they're canceled unless and we'll give you plenty of time beforehand to identify whether or not we need to actually keep those meetings or not, or reschedule them. But yes, we actually implemented the cultural holidays in 2023, and so that actually impacted some of our meetings. But because of the timing of our meetings being on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays, we weren't as impacted as much as some of the other boards and commissions. So you didn't see as many changes on your schedule. You're seeing a little more impacts in 2024.
Right, I just didn't know if like the city just takes it as a net loss, or if we still want those 2 meetings a month, and the idea, to your point, we've now answered.
Yeah,
So-
and because we have so many boards, commissions, and needs for council and chambers, it gets more and more difficult to find a new time, especially balancing all of your heavy schedules. And so we want to be able to respect that and the commitment that you made to the 2nd and 4th Thursdays as commissioners. But if we do see a need for a topic to go to you for discussion and we can't delay it or bring it forward, we'll look to then reschedule any of those.
Plus, we lost a city hall. Lost one of our meeting spaces.
We lost one of the buildings, yes, but we have plenty of other meeting spaces that we're able to use, and if needed, we could always meet at Tibbetts Creek Manor as an alternative to meeting in the council chambers.
That was my only observation. Yeah, Commissioner Milligan.
I just have a little question about the, can you scroll up for me to the top, the docket? Can you remind me, and I think the comp plan docket's going to be different this year because of the changes that we made last year. So it won't have the same kind of things.
Yes, for this docket, it'll primarily be the comprehensive plan and what's being proposed within it. At kind of the broad level, that should be within the docket. And so that's, as a reminder, the docket is just the approval of what'll go into that comp plan amendment for the year.
Oh, so it's not going to be the any individual items that we have seen in the past?
Outside of the comprehensive plan?
Yeah, were they, what am I thinking of? The docket that would have the zoning changes and those other things, where is that?
That's typically where you would see it, is on the docket, but we didn't actually have any proposed zoning changes from any external parties. But if we do have any, that's where you would see it, is on the docket.
Yeah, and then my follow-up question was, this is a public hearing, and so when is notice of the proposed docket published? Does anybody know? Up their head? It's not the Friday before, right? It's
No, no,
probably
no, no,
Something
it's-
like 2 weeks or something.
Yeah,
Okay.
Valerie has confirmed it's 2 weeks. Any other questions on the work plan? Any topics that our commissioners feel might be important?
Like
Okay.
whatever you guys throw at us. He's not gonna ask that next year. There's nothing.
You'll be pretty busy next year, but I like to ask that question if there's
That's a good
any
question.
raising topics.
Yeah, I don't know if this is some of what's in the second half, like, back up. But like, are there, on the functional plan piece, all right, is any of that under development next year? I know there's like the housing stuff, but would that come to us as are being developed?
Yes, as it impacts any goals or policies within the comprehensive plan, or if there's a land use or housing component that's impacted by changes to any functional plans, then yes, we would be bringing that to Planning Policy Commission for feedback and review.
So it's really just if there's an impact on comprehensive, the plans themselves.
Correct. But at the same time, we like to use a lot of our volunteer groups, that being the boards and commissions, to provide a lot of the diverse feedback from the community on any of our functional plans that we update.
All right, that looks like end of comments. Well, thank you, Stephen. But don't go anywhere, because now we'd like to discuss, with that being the end of our regular business, any city council updates or announcements.
Suppose I can just stay right here. There is a few council updates for you tonight. So I had mentioned that there's going to be continued discussion with City Council in January, or with you all in January, for the public hearing on the Pioneer Project program. And so at that meeting, you'll get a presentation on what we're proposing for the program as a follow-up from you all. But Council, earlier this week, if you want to see the discussion, they discussed the Pioneer Project program, the feedback you had provided, and as well as giving some guidance to staff of how to frame that program and present it for you all next year as for council. And then the other piece was for the public hearings, you will get a lot of the information presenting what the details are for the program, and then for the docket for that public hearing, also explaining what will be proposed for the comp plan amendments at a broad level for the comprehensive plan, as well as if there's any.
Great, thank you. All right. I think the final piece for this evening for PPC for 2023 is last minute announcements. I know, Stephen, we have a small party to attend to. Anyone that wants to attend it, this coming Wednesday, correct?
Yes, for those that perhaps didn't see the email invite, you're all invited to the end of the year party that the Economic Vitality Commission is holding. And I will send that email again if you would all like to join. And please let me know if you are interested in joining, just so we can track quorum.
Thank you, Stephen. Is there anything else from the commissioners? All right.
I have one last thing.
Sure.
You know, end of the year, I mean, the work doesn't stop. We, as you saw from the 2024 work plan, the work continues. But I do really appreciate a lot of the work that the commission has put into the work plan that we have for the conference plan. Sometimes it can be hard to go through that high level of detail for plan development or discussions. And it gets a little more interesting next year as we dive into regulation updates. And we really appreciate the commission's patience, as well as a lot of the feedback you provide for a lot of the meetings. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of a lot of the planning staff that have appreciated a lot of the discussions we've had in council chambers with you all.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And I guess on behalf of the commission, I want to thank our awesome staff. I want to thank Sarah and Robin for attending this evening, but also planning policy staff, Kristen, Valerie, Thomas, Jared, Tim, Chance, and of course, Stephen. Again, commissioners, all of you, for your time and your dedication to our wonderful city. And I hope you all have a happy holidays, happy New Year. Tonight's the first night of Hanukkah for those who are celebrating. And a great rest of 2023, and looking forward to 2024 with all of you. So thank you, and good evening.